So now it's finally time for us to do a deep dive into each of our 4 main biological macromolecules. And wait, actually that reminds me, let me write this down really fast, just in case we didn't go over what a macromolecule is yet. Macro just means large, molecule meaning molecule. So a biological macromolecule would simply be a large molecule that is required for life or in all living things. Okay? Okay, so these big biological macromolecules, as we briefly went over, are our carbohydrates, our nucleic acids, our proteins, and our lipids. Let's go ahead and get started learning a bit more now about carbohydrates. Carbohydrates, which most people just commonly call sugars, have 2 main functions. They are used for energy storage and as structural molecules, or molecules that help provide structures to things. Now, how can one easily identify a carbohydrate? The first big thing to look for is molecules with the suffix "ose" in their name, O-S-E, such as pentose or sucrose, fructose, or even glucose, right? Right away, you know you are dealing with a carbohydrate. Second, if you have the molecule's chemical formula, you can tell if it's a carbohydrate if it contains carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Specifically, for every 1 carbon and 1 oxygen atom present, there are 2 hydrogen atoms present, right? A good example is formaldehyde, or acetic acid, or erythrose, which are the molecules I just wrote out for you. And lastly, if you hear someone referring to sugars, kind of like I said earlier, all sugars are carbohydrates. Sound good? Now there are 3 main categories of carbohydrates. We have our monosaccharides, our disaccharides, and our polysaccharides. So let's start with the monosaccharides. Mono, again, meaning 1, and saccharide, meaning sugar. And so putting that together, we get our simple sugars. And so this is our single monomer of carbohydrates, our monosaccharides. It's just 1 unit of our carbohydrate, a single simple sugar, okay? So it makes sense then that these are the units that are often used as the building blocks for larger molecules. And one key thing to keep in mind about monosaccharides that's very important is that only monosaccharides can be absorbed or used by the human body. So if we were to ingest, like take in by eating, polysaccharides or disaccharides in our diet, we would actually have to digest and break down those larger molecules into monosaccharides in order to absorb them and use them in our bodies. Now let's move on to disaccharides. Disaccharides, as you might have figured out, right? Di meaning 2, and saccharide meaning sugar. Here we have our 2 monosaccharides put together to form what we call a disaccharide unit, right? So that's what a disaccharide is. 2 monomers of carbohydrates put together. Okay? So, what do these often do? These often are what serve as transport molecules in plants. And so because we eat plants, these also are what provide nutrition to animals. And now let's move on to polysaccharides. Poly, remember from before, means many. And now saccharide, we learned, means sugar. So polysaccharides are many sugars put together, right? Many monomers of carbohydrates all lumped together. So many monosaccharides bonded together make a polysaccharide. And so these are our complex sugars. So they provide energy storage, and they largely serve as structural components. Now, when we talk about carbohydrates in introductory biology courses, we mainly focus on 5 main carbohydrates. And these are glucose, glycogen, starch, cellulose, and chitin. Starting with glucose, glucose is a monosaccharide. So recalling from the last slide, this is our body's main source of energy. So we're going to be hearing about glucose a lot moving forward. But now let's trail off onto glycogen. Glycogen is the stored form of glucose that's usually found in animals, and it's made up of many connected glucose molecules all together. So what would that make it, a monosaccharide or a polysaccharide? Just as a little pop reminder. Okay, so that's glycogen, stored form of glucose found in animals. Starch, on the other hand, is also the stored form of glucose, but it's usually found in plants. Again, it's also made up of many connected glucose molecules, but since it's found in plants, this is what animals can then consume, and then the animals can convert the starch into glucose to be absorbed in the body, to be used to produce energy. And any extra glucose that the animal does not need to use right away is then stored in the animal's body as glycogen. So already you can see how these are all interconnected. Now, cellulose, like starch, is also found in plants, and it is also made up of many glucose molecules, so it's a polysaccharide, but its function is to provide structural support for plant cell walls. And then finally, we have chitin. Chitin is also a polysaccharide, but it's made up of many modified glucose molecules, and so it's used for structural support and is the primary component of the exoskeletons of arthropods, so a lot of bugs, and of the bodies of a lot of fungi, so mushrooms, as examples.